Hello, my name is Emily Dean. I am a student here at Drake State pursuing the medical assistant degree. I am before you to present our speaker today, Mr. William Hampton. William H. Hampton was born in Huntsville, Madison County, Alabama. Educated in the Huntsville City school system during the 1960s and 70s, William attended schools in every corner of the Rocket City. During segregation, William attended the Clara Ward Davis Kindergarten. After his family moved to South Huntsville, William was enrolled in a program sponsored by the Ford Foundation at Farley School on South Parkway. William was one of the first African Americans to attend Farley. An avid reader and always fascinated by stories by his family members, William learned to appreciate family history and history of his hometown. Given a camera at the age of 8 years old, William has captured a great deal of Huntsville, Madison County through the years. In 1978, William wrote a report for a history class titled Huntsville Revisited. From his report, William got the idea to write a book and record a documentary about his beloved Huntsville, Alabama. The project lay dormant until 2008, when William launched Huntsville Revisited on Facebook. This site is one of the most popular community pages in the United States. In addition to facilitating the revisited pages, William served as page administrator to 5 other pages related to history. William is a reenactor with the Festival of Voices at the Glenwood Cemetery and with Huntsville Pilgrimage Association at Maple Hill Cemetery. William also serves as a consultant for Huntsville City Schools' EarthScope Environmental Learning Program. In June 2020, a lifelong dream became reality, and William opened Huntsville Revisited Museum in Huntsville, Alabama. William is married to a former Linda Tate and is father of 2 sons and 1 daughter. William is a proud grandfather of 5. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. William Hampton.
Good morning, and it's a pleasure to be here. I am William Hampton from Huntsville Revisited, and I am sharing, going to give you a glimpse into some of the African-American history of Huntsville, Madison County, Alabama. Now, what I do when I share stories of Huntsville, I call it the front porch experience, because when I was a little boy, one of my greatest pleasures was getting to hang out with my great-grandparents, my grandparents, and great uncles and aunts. And I love sitting on the porch and listening to their stories. So I'm gonna kind of take you back into time and give you a glimpse of that. So we're gonna share some of the stories of Huntsville, Madison County, Alabama. So welcome to Huntsville Revisited. Now, we started off, we being Huntsville, we weren't always Huntsville. We were a city, a town called Twickenham. So in 1805, our founding father, a guy named Leroy Pope, named us Twickenham after Twickenham, England. Of course, 2 popular cities in Alabama, Birmingham and former Twickenham, now Huntsville, we were named after cities there in England. Well, the population, the Huntsville citizens were a little fed up with Leroy Pope and with, we're having some issues with England as well. So in 1811, the city decided to change the name from Twickenham to Huntsville. And that happened November 25th, 1811. So at that time, we became Huntsville. But now let's take an adventure in Negro history of Huntsville, Madison County, Alabama. We are known as a city of firsts. Huntsville was the scene of these firsts in Alabama. As I told you, 1811, we became Huntsville, so we were incorporated at that time. 1812, we had the first Masonic Lodge. In 1819, the state constitution was drafted here. You remember a couple of years ago, we celebrated our bicentennial in 2019. That's because in 1819, Alabama became a state. In 1819, the first session of the state legislature was held, and then in 1824, the first cotton mill was erected. And so as a city of firsts, the first university in the United States that was founded by a former slave was our very own Alabama A&M. founded by William Hooper Council. Dr. Council was born in 1848. Some records say 1849, but he lived from 1848, 1849 until 1909. And he was an educator, a race leader. He was born into slavery in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And his parents were both slaves on the Council plantation. Now, when Dr. Council was 5, his father escaped to Canada, and he tried unsuccessfully to obtain freedom for his family. And in 1857, William, his mother, and his brother, Cicero, they were sold to a Richmond, Virginia slave trader, who in turn sold them to Judge David Humphreys here in Huntsville at the Green Bottom Inn. So he was sold, and Dr. Council never saw his brothers again. Now, when Union troops arrived here, Dr. Council was able to escape across Union lines, and he went to Chattanooga for a short period of time during the Civil War. And he returned to Alabama in 1865. That's the year the war ended, the Civil War. And he attended school for freedmen that had been started by Quakers. And that was over in Jackson County, where Scottsboro is. This would become Council's only formal schooling. And he worked and studied for 3 years before graduating in 1867. Dr. Council went on to do some wonderful things. He became a publisher. He was also one of the founders of St. John AME Church here in Huntsville. Also, Dr. Council, long before Rosa Parks, long before Dr. Martin Luther King were involved in civil rights, because they weren't born yet, but Dr. Council had fought for his civil rights. He had purchased a ticket to on a train, first class ticket, and was heading to the first class section, and was informed that he couldn't sit there. A little scuffle ensued. Dr. Council was removed. He sued and won, but that decision also cost him his position as principal of Alabama A&M. So for 1 year, he was removed. Dr. Council's ambitions extended into politics, and he became the chief enrolling clerk of the Alabama House of Representatives between 1872 and 1874. Now, he was the first president of Alabama A&M. And in 1927, Dr. Joseph Fanning Drake became the president of what is now Alabama A&M. He became the 4th president, and during his tenure, he brought the university through difficult times. The faculty and the staff grew from 30 to more than 100. Now, one of the central figures that Dr. Drake was able to bring to Alabama A&M during his tenure, right? Here's a picture of Dr. Drake in his office. There was okay. This gentleman here is Mr. Simon Haley. Dr. Drake hired him, and he came to Alabama A&M as a professor. He was married to a lady named Bertha Palmer. So Bertha Palmer Haley. She actually died here in Huntsville, Alabama. And Simon and Bertha, right? This is Simon's mother. Her name is Queen Haley. So Simon and Bertha had a son who grew up in Huntsville, Alabama. The family moved to Huntsville, and so at age 5, this young man, Alex Haley, lived on the campus of what we know today as Alabama A&M. He graduated high school here at age 15. His mother died, and within the year, his father had remarried, and after graduating high school at age 15, instead of going to A&M, Alex went to Alcorn State, and from there he joined the Coast Guard, and of course later he wrote an autobiography of Malcolm X, but he wrote a book that became very popular and turned into a television miniseries called Roots. So Mr. Alex Haley has a connection to Huntsville, Alabama. And I have his 1937 high school graduating class. So if you look on down, you see Mr. Alexander Palmer Haley, address Normal, Alabama. And that's his 1937 graduating class. And many of you from Huntsville, Madison County, Alabama, might even have a family member listed here who attended high school with him. This is his high school graduation class, not college, his high school graduation class. The first bank in Alabama was built right here in Huntsville, 1835. Now, one significant thing about this bank is that it was built with slave quarters. This is a 1930s view of what was once the slave quarter entrance. I have the courtyard to the slave quarters. And you might wonder, why was a bank built with slave quarters? Well, in 1835, during slavery, when an enslaver who took out a loan with the bank was not able to pay, they came and got the property. So just like now, if you had a car that was repossessed, or any other item that you purchased that would be repossessed, the enslaved were chattel. So that property would be taken to the bank, held in the slave quarters. And we have the blueprints here, the first floor plans, slave quarters, First National Bank, Huntsville, Alabama. So if an individual was not able to pay up, the enslaved would be brought downtown and taken either to the courthouse, slave block, or any of the other blocks around town and sold off. Another fascinating history about Huntsville, North Alabama, is that there was a proposed state called Nickajack. And also within that region was an area called Winston County. During slavery, during the Civil War, there were certain pockets throughout the South, certain regions, they did not want to be a part of the Confederacy. So when the Confederate states seceded from the Union, there were areas within those states that seceded from the Confederacy, and they were called free states. In Alabama, one of those was the Free State of Winston. Over in Mississippi, they had the Free State of Jones. And there was a movie made about that state, which had a connection to Huntsville. The movie was based on the life of one Newton Jones. Forgive me, Newton Knight. Newton Knight was a Caucasian man who was not a slave owner. But after the emancipation, he married a former slave, and they had a daughter named Anna Knight. Anna Knight became a teacher. She eventually moved to Huntsville, Alabama, and spent the majority of her life here. The Anna Knight School at Oakwood College campus is named in her honor. Also during enslavement, this shows you the resolve of Huntsville African Americans. A slave movement in Huntsville. The slaves of Huntsville, Alabama recently made up a common purse and purchased a splendid hearse to be used for their interment of their dead. It cost about $350. Folks, this was back in the 1840s. One of those noted slaves who lived in Huntsville at one time was Dred Scott. You might have heard of his story. The Dred Scott decision, after he moved from Alabama to Missouri. He had gone to Illinois, and he actually sued for his freedom. Dred Scott lived on the campus of what we know today as Oakwood University. This is one of the slave shacks that was on that campus. In the early days of its history, these former slave shacks were used as dormitories for the men. Going to share the story of Mr. Peter Allen. Peter Allen moved to Huntsville around 1835, and he was a free Black man in the city of Philadelphia. And for whatever reason, we've never been able to find in any documentation as to the why. But Peter Allen, removed from the secure environment of Philadelphia, a city whose entire population of approximately 15,000 was free, to Huntsville, Alabama, where only 1% of the state's Black population enjoyed freedom. The reason for his immigration are unclear. All right, now I'm going to move on down to 1835 here. It says, beginning in late October 1835, appeals were published in several Alabama newspapers, including the Huntsville Southern Advocate, urging Alabamians to come to the aid of their brothers in Texas. So this is during the Texas Revolution. On the night of October 31st, 1835, an organizational meeting was held in Huntsville, and a volunteer company formed by Captain Peyton Wyatt. Although he was a free Black who had only recently arrived in the city, Peter Allen, a flutist, was welcomed into the company as a musician as it departed Huntsville on Sunday, November 8th, 1835. All right, the next section, it tells about their journey, but on bullet point 4, it says, oh, let me go back up a little bit, I'm sorry. Arriving in Texas in early December, Wyatt's company was mustered into service on December 25th, 1835. And on January 12th, 1836, they were dispatched to Goliad and then joined the volunteers at Refugio about January 22nd, 1836, with Wyatt on furlough. The Huntsville Volunteers were commanded by Lieutenant B.T. Bradford and participated in the Battle of Colledo Creek under Fannin before surrender on March 20th, 1836, and they were imprisoned at Goliad. Now, on the night before the massacre, because there was a great, you heard about the Alamo, but there was also another massacre in Texas during the Revolution. It says the night before the massacre, Captain Jack Shackelford, commander of the Alabama Red Rovers, recalled that the musicians of the troop, which would have included Peter Allen, played the tune Home Sweet Home on their flutes as tears rolled down many a manly cheek. The next morning, Palm Sunday, March 27, 1836, the men were awakened at dawn by their Mexican guards, split into 4 divisions and marched outside the fort, each group proceeding in a different direction. Some minutes later, Shackelford heard shots and the screams of men as they were being executed. Later that day, the mangled corpses of his comrades were burned by the Mexicans. Peter Allen's siblings in Philadelphia, John Allen, Sarah Wilkins, and Mary Adams, claiming to be his only heirs, obtained title to 4,036 acres of land in Texas as a result of Peter's service. When Peter's wife Mary proved her marriage and filed a claim as well, the Philadelphia heirs objected and protracted court battles ensued, and that ended in the Texas Supreme Court. So anyway, Mary Allen, Peter's wife, his widow, is buried here in Huntsville in Glenwood Cemetery, and Peter is buried in a mass grave there in Texas. But that's a Huntsville story connected to Peter Allen. His father was the founder of the AME Church. We have O.W. Gurley. It's our next. Okay, that's the frame before that was a rendering, an artist's rendering of Peter Allen. Now we have O.W. Gurley. His name is Ottawa. He was born in Huntsville, December 25th, 1868. Now, this gentleman was born free. His parents were African slaves of Captain Frank Gurley here in Madison County. There's a town that bears the surname now. Gurley is named in honor of Frank Gurley. But O.W. Gurley is a descendant of former slaves of Captain Gurley. Now, the family resided out in a little area there, northeast Madison County. They left Huntsville when Ottawa was about eight years old or so and moved to Pine Bluff, Arkansas. So he grew up there, became a businessman, an entrepreneur, and he, from Arkansas, he moved to Oklahoma as the United States was expanding westward. And he had a presidential appointment that he resigned when he got to Oklahoma. Well, he was able to purchase the first 40 acres of land that could be sold to a colored person. And he, in turn, would only sell to other colored people. He became, he built banks and hotels and restaurants and called the area Greenwood. We know the area today as Black Wall Street. The founder of Black Wall Street is from Huntsville, Alabama. His name is O.W. Gurley. Let's skip past the next two. We should be at Samuel R. Lowry. Samuel R. Lowry was born near Nashville around 1831 or so. He became an attorney. His father was also an attorney. They were preachers. Well, around 1835, around 1875, Samuel R. Lowry moved to Huntsville, Alabama, and he set up a law office. He also was an inventor, and he was a horticulturist. So he was very good with plants and whatnot. And one of his expertise was mulberry trees and mulberry bushes. He was at an event, and someone had given a box of silkworms. He and his family in turn learned how to cultivate silk. They actually started a silk industry here in Huntsville, Alabama. He also has the distinction of being the first African American to argue a case before the United States Supreme Court. Huntsville, Alabama, Samuel R. Lowry. And this is an artist rendering of the school, them cultivating the silk and working with the cocoon on the wall in the right-hand image of the photo. This is a photo of Dr. Hugh Bone. He was a dentist out near Gurley, Alabama, in an area called Ryland. The old folks call it Hurricane. But Dr. Bone was a dentist, and almost every Bone in Huntsville they're all related. They are descendants of some of the Bone slaves. Well, the Bone slaves, I believe, the first African Americans in Madison County to be taught to read. Dr. Bone taught his slaves to read so that when they came into town, they would know when he was being cheated by local merchants and whatnot. Of course, the merchant didn't know that these slaves could read, but during enslavement, he had taught them. The Bone Plantation House still stands there in Gurley. Well, it's actually Ryland, Alabama. This is a local singer and actress who portrayed Zenya Pruitt. Zenya Pruitt was a local caterer. Huntsville has a neighborhood called Lily Flag. Lily Flag was actually a famous cow, and she was the largest butter producer, milk producer in the world back in the 1890s. In the World's Fair, she beat out all the other cows. And Huntsville threw a big celebration. So Zenya Pruitt, who was also a teacher, she went to school at Alabama A&M. Her college tuition was paid for by Dr. William Hooper Council. He had encouraged her to go and further her education. But Zenya Pruitt was a caterer who was known nationally for her meals. And so they would bring her to big events all over the country to be the cook. She's buried right next to Leroy and Dora Lowry, who are the parents of Dr. Joseph Lowry, civil rights leader. We can skip past these next few and go to, let's see. All right, should be at Matt Gray. He is leading a team of oxen and mules and cows. Well, I don't say a mule, but a team of beasts down Franklin Street here in Huntsville. Matt Gray has a fascinating story in that he served in the Confederate Army. And the reason being, he was born enslaved. When Union troops came to Huntsville, they captured Uncle Matt along with some Confederate soldiers. And Uncle Matt was the name he was affectionately known as. They captured Uncle Matt and some Confederate soldiers and tied him to a mule. And they drove the mule into the river. And the mule actually swam. And I only found this out a few years ago. I didn't realize mules could swim. But he didn't drown. The mule swam to the other bank. And Uncle Matt made in a statement, he lived to be almost 100 years old. And in an interview in the 1930s, he stated that after that incident, he had no more use for a Yankee. So many African Americans served in the Confederacy, not so much for a love of country, but for survival. And then even some of them were mistreated by Union troops, and so they served. This next image shows a 1928 Confederate reunion here in Huntsville. And you see to the far right, two former slaves who served in the Confederate Army in some kind of capacity. Our next photo is one Mr. Bartley Harris, the oldest African-American congregation in the state of Alabama is St. Bartley Primitive Baptist Church. And it is named in honor of this gentleman, Mr. Bartley Harris. And this next scene is a baptismal scene downtown Huntsville, Alabama. And it shows, this is an actual photograph taken by a local photographer named Ira Collins. And he captured the scene, like I said, 1835. And in his career, Bartley Harris baptized over 3,000 people. Campus of Alabama A&M was once the site of the Green Bottom Inn. It had an internationally known racetrack out there. A horse that trained out there was Grey Gander, trained and lived here in Huntsville. And here in the 1800s, Grey Gander won a purse of $20,000. And many notables, including President James Monroe, James K. Polk, and Andrew Jackson stayed there. Another photo of Samuel Lowry. Now we're at Glenwood Cemetery, which is the historic cemetery here in Huntsville of prominent African Americans who were buried there. Originally, the African Americans in Huntsville, those who weren't buried on plantations out around the county, there was an area called Old Georgia. What we know today as Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi was once one big landmass. And Georgia was cheated out of their land in what was called the Yazoo land fraud. Well, many of the slaves that came here came from Savannah and other parts of Georgia. So they lived in an area called Old Georgia and had a cemetery set up there as well. It's called Old Georgia. Today, Huntsville Hospital sits on that former cemetery. And so many of those interments were supposedly moved to what we know today as Glenwood. So there at Glenwood are several of our early business leaders. We have Buffalo soldiers buried there. As I stated earlier, Zenya Pruitt. We have Dora and Leroy Lowry, parents of Joseph Lowry. Matt Gray, Uncle Matt is buried there. We have the Henry Benford. We have Daniel Brandon, who is buried there. And Daniel Brandon was one of 9 of our first aldermen. Many people here in Huntsville think that Richard Showers was our first African-American city councilman, or Devin Keith. Both fine gentlemen, doing great jobs in their public service. But prior to them, we had 9, and Daniel Brandon was one of them, and he's buried out there. All right. Also, Dr. Burgess Scruggs, one of the first African-American doctors and licensed doctors in the state of Alabama, and the first in Huntsville. All right, just more images of Glenwood. Right, this gentleman, Mr. Aaron Burns, he was the owner, well, he managed the Longview Cotton Gin. The next picture is a picture of the Longview Cotton Gin. African-American farmers, cotton farmers, were not getting a fair price at the gins here in town. So they saved up their money and built their own gin. And many of the sharecroppers, the African-American sharecroppers who lived on white farms, were then pressured and told not to do business with the Longview gin. That if they did, these are the African-American farmers who were, they're cotton farmers. But if they took their cotton to Longview, then they would have to leave these white farms. So that put pressure on the farmer and on the Longview gin. So it only survived, not for a long period of time, like some of the other gins in town. We have the Conleys. Pascal Conley also served the United States as a Buffalo Soldier. Pascal was one of the first original Conley brothers to move to downtown Huntsville. And according to the census and bank records between 1860, and we're talking about, the Civil War started in 1861. So between 1860 and 1870, he maintained a townhouse in Harrison Alley. And I believe that was the alley behind where present day Harrison Brothers Furniture. And on the main town square, our town square has been where it always is since our existence. So Pascal had a business down there where the Madison County Courthouse and municipal garage stand today. He also shared a farm on the Conley compound out in Madison, and it was managed by his brothers, William Conley, Felix, and his sister Paralee. Pascal's Caucasian appearance and manners learned from a childhood spent around the Green Bottom Inn, that's on the campus of A&M, the Green Bottom Horse Track, allowed him to mingle among the white men who ran the downtown business district. It was from downtown Huntsville that Pascal would source new building projects for his brothers. To the east, across the alley, was the city engine house, and to the west, the barbershop occupied by Levi Scruggs, who was the barber for wealthy white men in Huntsville. So these are black men. So Levi Scruggs was the barber for wealthy white men in Huntsville. Pascal was friends with Levi and his uncle, Burgess Scruggs, who was the first black doctor in Huntsville. Levi's youngest son, Zan, would marry Pascal's granddaughter, Jessie Lee. And all right, the next story, the next person we have is Mr. Shandy Wesley Jones. Go to the next picture there. And Mr. Jones, he was a native of Huntsville. He was the son of a white farmer and a mulatto mother. He, his mother, and two sisters were emancipated from slavery in 1820. That's 41 years before the Civil War. Jones would later become one of the first African-American state legislators in Alabama history. Now, if you notice, this man died in 1886, before the 1900s even rolled in. This says that he was one of the first African-American state legislators in Alabama. So this is confusing to some folks because they think, well, how is that so? And we didn't get our rights to vote until 1964. Well, see, during the Civil War, the white men who fought for the Confederacy, they Confederate soldiers, when the war was over and the southern states rejoined the Union, the white men who fought for the Confederacy lost their right to vote. See, they didn't think this thing through, because now you got all these folks who now have the right to vote. These former slaves, millions of them. So they were electing, blacks all throughout the South, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, Georgia. So when you look at some of these old photos from the 1800s and you see these pictures of black folk in there, it's like, how is that in the 1800s? Well, that's what happened. So now, as we enter the 1900s, they're thinking this thing through. We got to get this vote from these folks. So they come up with the grandfather clauses and the Jim Crow laws and the poll taxes and the literacy tests. So all that stuff played into that. All right, so that's Shandy Wesley Jones. This is Mr. C.C. Moore, Huntsville's first black postman. Right, let's go on past Lewis. The next frame is, I told you about Anna Knight. That's her on the campus of Oakwood. And then our next frame is Adeles Supper Club. Now, there's a book called Hit Me Fred. That's a book based on the life of Fred Wesley, who was one of James Brown's band members. And James Brown used to get some of his musicians from Huntsville. A lot of great talent come out of this town. Well, Adeles Supper Club was down there on Church Street. It was a popular night spot. B.B. King, Sam Cooke, Aretha Franklin, Johnny Taylor, Brooke Benton, a lot of those artists would come through and perform down there on Church Street back in the day. But Adele Supper Club was one of those. We had our own Church Street, and that whole life was like Harlem, like life, just a vibrant, energetic scene downtown Huntsville. Church Street, some of the businesses there. The next one should be the Princess Theater. The Princess Theater was there on Church Street. So this was where it wasn't Black owned, but it was owned by whites, but it was the movie theater for the Black citizens here in Huntsville. There's another scene of the Princess from the late 50s, early 60s. I put together a partial list of businesses that were on Church Street. Everything from barbershops, beauty shops, bakeries, grocery stores, and in downtown Huntsville is where you went. You didn't have the malls and the shopping centers all out that are in the suburbs now. All of the business and the commerce happened downtown. Another Church Street business, the Carter House, down on Church Street. And Church Street gets its name because we had a good deal of churches there. Huntsville had a Negro drive-in theater. It was called the Regal. It closed in the early 60s, and you can see here for colored only. It sat near the intersection of Meridian and Winchester. So just a short distance from where we are here at Drake. All right, in 1900, Dr. William Hooper Council heard the music of this fine musician and brought him to Huntsville. 1900, Alabama A&M founder, William Hooper Council hired William Christopher Handy, W.C. Handy, to come be the band director. And at the time, A&M was known as the State Agricultural and Mechanical College for Negroes. What we know as the Marching Maroon and White band was the A&M College Band. Handy, an Alabama native, left the university in 1903. So he spent 3 years here in Huntsville, and he went on to become a world famous blues composer and musician. And Handy was A&M's second band director. And this next slide shows Dr. Handy in later years. All right. And go to the picture of Mr. Lewis Baxter Moore. In 1896, Lewis Baxter Moore, he was born in 1866, he died in 1928. He made history when he became the first African American to earn a Doctor of Philosophy degree from the University of Pennsylvania. All right, born in Huntsville. All right, after his graduate work at Penn, Dr. Moore went on to teach Latin, pedagogy, philosophy, psychology, and education at Howard University, where he served for many years as the Dean of Howard's Teachers College. After becoming an ordained minister, the Reverend Dr. Moore spent the last 3 years of his life in Philadelphia as the pastor of Faith Presbyterian Church in Germantown. Right, many of you know this guy in the middle as Sammy Davis Jr. Well, the gentleman to our right, his left, is Will Mashton. Will Mashton was born in Huntsville in 1899. He is the gentleman who launched the career of Sammy Davis Jr. We have here Mr. Arnold Bontemps, who was a member of the Harlem Renaissance, a contemporary of Langston Hughes, a very important member of the Harlem Renaissance. Well, he lived in Huntsville in the 1930s. In 1931, he was a teacher out at Oakwood College, and he was very disturbed by the case of the Scottsboro boys, and he wrote quite a bit about that, and which didn't sit well with the college administration at the time. So he eventually left Huntsville, eventually ended up teaching at Fisk, and he died there in Nashville, and is buried in Nashville, Tennessee. But his name is Arnold Bontemps, and he has a book titled Sad Faced Boy, which is based on the life of some children here in Huntsville, Alabama. We have here Mr. Elmore Harris, who was our next great track star after Jesse Owens. But in 1940, the United States was at war, and we ended up not participating in the Olympic Games that year. So Mr. Harris did not get to participate, but he became one of the first 5 African Americans to sign a pro football contract from a predominantly Black college. He graduated from the same high school that Alex Haley graduated from, which was their only campus of A&M. That school would eventually evolve into Council Training School, but Elmore Pepper Harris. I shared with you earlier the story of Dr. Burgess Scruggs, Huntsville's first first licensed African-American doctor. Dr. Samuel Beard, who was instrumental in setting up the Negro wing at the Huntsville Hospital. And here's a picture of the Negro wing, the 1920s, the Colored Annex, what they called it. So it sat on the corner of Half Street and Oak Avenue, so not far from Council High School that was demolished not too long ago. We talked about Huntsville being a city of firsts. Huntsville is the first city in the state of Alabama to integrate its public school system. We have a picture of Governor Wallace here holding a newspaper, Birmingham Post-Herald. The headline says, "Huntsville defies Wallace." Vivian Malone, she's standing in front of Joseph F. Drake Hall. Many of you have seen the iconic picture of George Wallace standing in front of Foster Auditorium, where the soldiers have to come and ask him to step aside, where he made his infamous speech regarding segregation. And when he steps aside, Vivian Malone is the female that you see. But prior to attending the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, she was a student at Huntsville's Alabama A&M University. This next picture is Eva B. Dykes. She is the first African-American woman to receive a PhD. She went on to teach at Oakwood College here in Huntsville. All right, go to the next photo. That's Miss Jeanette System. African-Americans such as Jeanette System, who have been essential to the success of our space program. Ms. System joined NASA Marshall Space Flight Center in 1964 after earning a bachelor's and master's degrees in mathematics from Alabama A&M. System published a NASA report in 1967, Survey of Solar Cycle Prediction Models, which put forward techniques for improved forecasting of the sunspot cycle. In the mid-70s, she worked as a space scientist in the Space Environment branch of Marshall Space Scientists Laboratory, and later led activities in Marshall's atmospheric, magnetosphere, and plasmas in space project. In 1975, she wrote an article for the National Technical Association, Equal Employment Opportunity and the Supervisor, a counselor's view. So that's one of Huntsville's hidden figures in the NASA program. We have the next, Mrs. Chessie Harris, who was an advocate for children and the elderly. Huntsville still feels the effects of her efforts to foster and to take care of children who have been homeless, who were orphans, and the unwanted. And she was an advocate for that. So this is Ms. Chessie Harris. We have Dr. Robert Shernie, who was a NASA scientist, engineer, inventor. And Dr. Robert Shernie was a World War II veteran. He was a physical and electrical engineer and is recognized as one of NASA's heroes of his design concepts aided Apollo 15, 16, and 17's lunar missions towards success. His design for the lunar rover tires was an extraordinary success for NASA and engineering design. This next image shows the lunar rover that went to the moon. Dr. Shernie, Huntsville's own, designed the tires that were used on there. He also designed the waste management system that was used on the space shuttle and on Skylab. The astronauts, they're in those uniforms and they're in space, and going to the bathroom was a challenge. So Dr. Shernie is who invented the space toilet. Used there in outer space. We have here Mr. Leroy and Mrs. Viola Garrett, founders of WEUP Radio, the first African-American owned radio station in the state of Alabama, one of the first in the United States. Mr. Garrett fought and won a battle with the FCC, which changed the laws regulating frequency and whatnot. And he's a pioneer in radio. That's our very own Mr. Leroy Gary. Born in Birmingham, or he started his radio career in Birmingham, but he ended here in Huntsville, Alabama. This next scene is a gentleman named Herman Blount, born in Birmingham, Alabama, but came to Huntsville as a student at Alabama A&M. He was a music major. And while in Huntsville, he was abducted, according to him, by aliens and taken to Saturn. He went on to become a jazz fusion pioneer. We know today as Sun Ra, but he developed his Sun Ra persona here in Huntsville. Our next image is the Buffalo Soldiers who made their way to Huntsville in October of 1898. We have the 10th Cavalry Buffalo Soldiers who were camped here in our city in an area we know today as 10th Cavalry Hill. Tells you Uncle Sam and the 10th Cavalry. Their stay here was not too pleasant. There was some trouble with some of the white citizens. Thought these guys, they thought that these guys considered themselves, they were uppity and really didn't want them here. So their stay here was unpleasant. I have a roster of the Buffalo Soldiers. And here I have Sergeant George Berry holding the stars and stripes and the colors, the 10th Cavalry colors. This is an artist rendering of a picture here in Huntsville, Alabama. This next picture is an artist rendering of Sergeant Berry rushing up San Juan Hill with the stars and stripes and the 10th Cavalry colors as they did battle there in the Spanish-American War. Right, and let's go to the next scene. That's a photo. That's the actual photo of George Berry holding the stars and stripes and the 10th Cavalry colors. And there is a historic marker on the site of the encampment at the school, Calvary Hill. Another first for Huntsville. Another first for Huntsville. We can go to that last scene, Negro History of Huntsville, Madison County. Another first for Huntsville, Mr. Robert Brandon. I told you about some of the first and the people who were buried at Glenwood. I found out about 3 months ago that we had police officers in the 1800s. I have an article here from 1881, and Mr. Robert Brandon, a worthy citizen, he was then and is now a member of the police force of the city of Huntsville. And this was April 1881. And so there are other accounts of Robert Brandon being one of our police officers. We also had firemen back in the 1800s. So Huntsville, a city founded on the backs from the labor, founded on the backs of the labor of our ancestors, African Americans, who played an important part in building the homes, the businesses, contributing to the commerce. We are now a space industry from cotton to the space industry. Local African-American citizens have been instrumental in building this community. So I thank you for allowing me to share some of the story of these individuals, and I appreciate it.